And then the second one, right? Now this is always a little scary when I'm talking to Lutherans. I'm going to blame the rise of unbelief on the Reformation, but here I go. I'm like a Presbyterian Methodist, so I don't get out of this either. Right, yeah. It's a little confusing, but there we go. Again, this is an argument historians make, but the argument goes something like this. Before the Reformation, there's not a clear distinction between the sacred and the secular, right? The church bells toll the time. That's just part of life, okay? But one of the things the Reformation does is to say that there's something called the secular, the realm where we operate by slightly different rules. So, for instance, Martin Luther, right, talks about God operating by the theory of two kingdoms. Right, I'm seeing some of you Lutherans nod your head and some of you giving me like, oh, what? I don't really understand it either, right? No, but for Luther, he's not saying that God just abandons part of the world, but that what he'll say is, if you're a prince or you're a leader, right, you can't actually follow the rules of the Sermon on the Mount in political leadership. Turning the other cheek isn't an option for you if your job is to protect the weak against the aggression of the strong. Right? Turning the other cheek at that point is actually the wrong thing to do. Okay? So there are slightly different rules, right? And ways of thinking in, again, this sort of secular world. Okay? Now, Luther isn't saying that that world isn't God's world, or it's not part of God's good creation. Not at all. But he's making a distinction. We can now talk about, the church and what happens outside the church. Calvin does much the same thing, right? There's the church, and then there's the civil realm. A lot of people think that Calvin and Calvinists were all about theocracy. Not really true. Calvin wanted there to be civil rulers who were distinct from the ministers, right? When the Puritans set up their colonies in North America, the ministers aren't the government. The government's the government. Now, the ministers and the government work together. But again, there's this distinction. So all of which is to say, space is desacralized, meaning there's not this sense that everything is just sort of flooded with God. There's now this separation. It's possible to think, again, about a secular and a sacred, right? So, put it another way, and this is a little too stark, but maybe think about it this way. Most of us can operate with multiple calendars, right? It's Lent, right? But you also, most of you, operate by a work calendar or a school calendar. We operate by a tax calendar, right? And we see those other calendars as being separate, or in different worlds, from our Lenten calendar. All right. The other one is this. I'm going to say one more thing about the Reformation. The other thing the Reformation does, and I don't have it up here, but I think it's an important point, is it gives people choice. It gives people choice, right? Before the Reformation, in Europe, Western Europe, you basically had one choice. You could be Catholic. You could be an unhappy Catholic, right? You could be a not particularly good Catholic, but you were Catholic. And there weren't a lot of other options. And the options that rose up were pretty quickly, by and large, put down. Okay? Well, the Reformation unleashes choice. I mean, this is the moment where the Catholics do get the last laugh, because what they said is, if you start letting people come to their own interpretations of the Bible, you're going to have lots and lots of different interpretations. And the early reformers all said, no, everyone will read it and get the same thing. And then, of course, they didn't. Right? And so then we get lots of different kinds of Protestants, right? And so now a couple of things happen. happen. You can look and, I mean, do you agree with Luther's understanding of the Eucharist or Calvin's? Who's right? And that changes a little bit what people mean by belief. This is, again, probably overstated, but I think there's enough truth in it today. For someone like Luther, working with sort of medieval concepts, which he was, right? Belief is that in which you put your trust. To believe is to fall back into the arms of God, right? This may be a thing of, right, certain generations, but when I was going to, youth group and stuff, we would do these things called trust exercises, which let's just all stop and recognize that teaching 14-year-olds that they should trust 14-year-olds is actually probably a bad. Why they thought this was a good idea, I'm not exactly sure. We never did this with the adults in the congregation, right? Like the message that you should really trust your elders because they are wise and there for you. But no, we do this with other 14-year-olds. But you'd like get up on a table or something, and you're supposed to like fall back into the arms of people who would cross their arms, right? And it was, I think it was supposed to, the message I think was supposed to be that whatever divisions there are in like your junior high or your high school, these people are really here for you. Which again, the way that high school operated, like that was a complete joke. But anyway, all of that to say is even though it was probably a terrible youth group exercise, that's much how like someone like Luther understood belief. What do you fall back to? Okay, what do you give yourself completely to? But in the Reformation, now that you have options, belief begins to take on a meaning that we're probably actually more familiar with, which is, what do you give intellectual assent to? Okay, what do you give intellectual assent to? Okay? There is a difference between believing in God in the sense of falling back into the arms of God in this, with the sense of I have nothing else, and believing in God in the sense of, yes, that's a proposition I accept. That change, that doesn't all instantly happen in the Reformation, but it comes out of, it's one of the things that comes out of it, right? Belief becomes intellectual assent, which means that divine things can become propositions that you give assent to. All right, scientific revolution. This one is probably a little bit clearer on how this works. But the scientific revolution, which again was a lot of the participants in it were devout Christian people. Isaac Newton certainly was. But the idea now that you can define the world mathematically, right? You can figure out how the world works and put it into a mathematic equation. It's sort of the scientific equivalent of Machiavelli's The Prince, right? You don't necessarily need a God to understand the second law of thermodynamics. Okay, that's not exactly true. I probably need divine intervention to understand the second law of thermodynamics. But the second law of thermodynamics, am I right? There's like a second law. Right, okay, I'm just making that up. Yeah. My science education in college was a little bit dubious, so we'll just kind of put a veil over that. But God isn't a necessary part of that explanation, right? You're trying again to explain things on human terms. Okay? The idea that you can explain the world without reference to God. And explain it well. Right? You don't need God to make all the pieces fit. Okay? And even just the notion that when I'm trying to explain the world, my ultimate objective isn't to figure out how everything relates to God is a pretty big change in, again, plausibility structure. It's a shift. A shift that happens over a long period of time and at different rates for different people, but it's a shift. All right, go to the next slide. So, the question now becomes, given all of these changes, what did church people do? What did church leaders do? How do they respond to these new ways of thinking? And here I'm relying on a book, as I am off and on throughout this entire piece, by a historian by the name of James Turner called Without God, Without Creed. And here's what he said. This is one of those terrible PowerPoint slides where I put a bunch of text on it, which you're actually not supposed to do in PowerPoint, but anyway. All right, so church leaders, in effect, he said, had continually to judge during that span of time how, if at all, this new mentality bore on religious beliefs. So what's the relationship between these new ways of thinking and religious beliefs? Should the church conclude that rationalization, again, these very mathematical ways, these very rational ways, provided a solid approach to God as well as to physical reality and expend the role of logic in religion, and weld beliefs securely to that new outlook? Or should theologians decide that the appropriate kind of concrete, precise thinking appropriate to natural philosophy and mercantile life did not suit thinking about God, reject it as misleading and religion, and bend their efforts to strengthening autonomous foundations for belief? So to break that down, what he's basically saying is church leaders had to decide, is the way we think about the laws of nature the best way to try and think about God? Or do you say, God's actually not the same sort of metaphysical reality as the laws of nature, and we have to have a different language for talking about God? How we talk about science is fine, but we don't talk about God the same way we talk about science. Okay? And what Turner argues, right, is that this is a really hard moment, or series of moments, for church leaders. Because you can be damned either way. If you decide to say, look, our language about God is a distinct language. It's not the same language as science, or economics, or politics. You can't talk about God the same way. You risk people saying, right, you're being anti-intellectual. You're refusing to acknowledge the ways of the world. You risk all of that, right? But, right, if you weld God to science, or to economics, or to those ways of thinking, you risk a couple of things. One, right, what happens when the science changes? What happens when your ways, you figured out how God fits in this scientific theory? What happens when scientists say, oh, that's not actually the way the world works? And what happens then? Or what happens when the scientists say, we needed God, you put God in this scientific theory to fill in this thing we didn't understand, but we understand it now. Where'd God go? So this is a tough moment for church. Or again, it's not a moment. It's a series of moments. How are you going to navigate through this territory? So you want to go to the next.